Hey everyone, I'm super excited today to present another episode of Founder Stories. Today we have the absolute honor to host our dear friend Shay David. Now we all know building a startup is hard. One startup is hard enough, and then a second startup could be even harder. But imagine building not just one startup, not two startups, not three startups, but four startups. Shay David has founded two startups previously, and then he went on to go ahead and found another startup called Tura, which is itself a unicorn and an incredible story. And right now he's currently building another startup called retrain.AI. Shay is not only an accomplished entrepreneur, he's also an accomplished scholar, philosopher. He has a PhD from Cornell and has gone to Yale, and he has multiple other different types of things under his belt. But he's also a dad, a father, a husband, and multiple other things. I'm very excited today to have Shay with us to share with us his story, his journey, his struggles, his success, and all the lessons he learned so we can apply those to our own life. So Shay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ephraim, and it's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into it. So Shay, as you know, every story has a backstory. You know, it's not just all of a sudden you showed up here today and an accomplished entrepreneur that's already sold a startup, that has another startup going public, and, you know, is building the next, you know, phenomenal startup for, you know, the future of work. But why don't you let's go all the way back to your backstory of where you're from and what your upbringing was like.
Yeah, so I grew up in Israel, the north part of Israel, kind of a rural, suburban community, I would say. And it was kind of a nice, happy childhood, you would say, with maybe the formative experience of that childhood was actually my first trip to the US. My father used to work for the Israeli government, and we had an opportunity when I was a kid, together with my younger brothers, to move from the small little town in Israel to Palo Alto. And that was a very formative experience for me because all of a sudden, from small town North Israel, we're in the middle of it all, where Silicon Valley was just beginning to happen. This was early 80s. And excitement of moving to another country, but also realizing that something big was happening in that area was, I think, a formidable experience. And one thing I remember as a child was my first visit to Costco. When we were children, we had all these electric toys, like remote controlled cars and whatnot. One of the most lucrative gifts you could ever get was one of those. But the problem was that batteries would always run out really quickly. And I remember the first time I visited Costco, where you would get batteries in packs of 100. 100 batteries seemed like the treasure you could only hear about in legends. So I think that was kind of an interesting early memory in that era.
What other early memories do you have that were formative in your growth as a child, as a teen, and an adolescent, and everything?
I think that again, going back between Israel and the US, we were very kind of free roaming. I think back then we didn't have the helicopter parenting style that some of us probably exert now. Mm-hmm. The kids were the kids, and you'd finish school early. Schooling was a major focus. In our elementary schools, we had 40 kids to the class with one 22-year-old teacher. So, and we would only learn 4 or 5 hours in a day. So much of education was actually done with the guys and girls after school. People would go home. The kids would, of course, come back from school on their own. Parents wouldn't pick you up. And then in the afternoon, all the kids would meet to play sports or play soccer in the yard, or go to the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts and just roam around the place where we were living. It was a kind of a rural community, so oftentimes we were outside building tree houses, walking around with our dog. It was a very sweet memory of a very kind of innocent childhood, if you will. Very different than what it is today.
For sure.
And of course, nobody had cell phones, so we actually had to talk with one another.
So, I mean, if you look at look at your own children and how they're growing up, or just and all your friends' children, and look at the way your child, back then, everyone said after school, people first of all hung out together. played soccer, did everything else, hung out at the playground, whatever else it was. So you had that whole entire, connection of community within the kids. And the kids sort of all the education was done outside of school on the soccer field. So negotiation skills, getting into fights and making up. And, kids we had the responsibility of walking home themselves. Where now it's like, we're living on our cell phones. We're living with technology. It's like, let me run home and play my PS4.
Right.
Totally type of different spectrum and totally different generations and everything.
Absolutely. But I think technology in itself is not good or bad, right? You could be on your cell phone having a social conversation with a friend from out of town, or continuing a conversation you had in school, and that in itself is fine. So, I often, like many other parents, I try to limit screen time for my children, but not because I think that inherently technology is good or bad, but because I want to direct their attention to a diverse set of activities.
Right.
I think back then, no, we didn't have any of that, and human interaction was probably the focus. Today, when you think about using screens, mostly cell phones, but not just cell phones, it's emails, it's calls, it's all the rest of it, and definitely with the risk associated with social media, I think we can put our attention on activities that actually enhance social norms and enhance human connection versus you playing in your room in the dark your PS4 in a non-social game, right? So it really depends on, are you using technology to foster social connection or not? For some people, playing Fortnite could be the height of social activity because you hear your friends and you can play with them and you can collaborate and you can negotiate and all the things that we might have done on the soccer field.
Right.
A few years ago, you could actually do that online right now. So in that sense, it's not good or bad. But I think we have to make sure that through the technological connection, we don't lose the human connection.
Gotcha. So what is the bad part about it?
I think that the bad part about it is that too much use of technology, and particularly cell phones, I think, could resort to solipsism. Oh, I'd just rather play Candy Crush on my phone and not interact. And it's definitely less socially awkward. And I can control it, and it gives a fake sense of control and a fake sense of spending my time with things that I love to do, right? The opposite of that is that, yes, you lose that human connection. I think that's kind of bad. And beyond that, I think there's a lot of research to show that actually being outside, being active, playing sports, and not necessarily just hunched in front of the screen is probably better for you as an embodied being, because we all have a body, even though we sometimes forget it.
No, for sure. And like you mentioned, technology can be either used for good or it can be used for bad. It could be used as a way to, in a bad, negative sense, is like constantly being on social media, comparing yourself and looking at like the grass is greener on the other side constantly, or seeing what other people have, which just start fostering jealousy. But at the same time, you mentioned it could be the good part, which you're being able to connect with everyone around the world, being able to spread positive messages and other types of things, and collaborate. So it has both spectrums, but like everything else in the world, the good and the bad, and make sure you only take the good from it.
Correct.
So you have these formative childhood years. You grow up in, suburban over there in the north. And, you have the pivotal moments where you go to Silicon Valley and you start realizing the whole new industry, the new age of computer science and what technology could do and software. But where does as your father working for the government, and I'm not sure what your mother did, but where does your own personal entrepreneurship drive come from? And is there any type of early experiences that you realize that these are things that created something within you? Or just something that just came naturally later?
I think some of it really started in Silicon Valley. The first computer that I had wasn't even mine. In Palo Alto, early days of personal computing, before you can even buy a computer in the store or in a Radio Shack, you could go to the library for 1 hour a week if you remember to order your queue and get access to 1 hour of compute per week per person. And there was no permanent memory. So within that 1 hour, you needed to create your program, type it, debug it, run it, see the results, and see what happens. That was my first kind of experience with computing. This was like, I believe they had the Texas Instrument 99 or something like that. And after that, by the end of that year, we actually got our own personal computer to connect to our TV at home. So that was kind of my first experience of understanding that something big was going to happen and that kind of compute was going to be important. So I think part of it was there, like the realization that there's a new thing coming, a new type of technology I was very hands-on with stuff like that, and that kind of gave me ideas. And later, when I came back to Israel, I had an opportunity of actually teaching people to use computers. So seeing how people could do things with it. First applications for word processors and spreadsheets and stuff like that. But I had the capability to kind of go around the little town I grew up in and give private lessons in computing and kind of see the expressions on people's faces as they learned, both adults and kids. And that kind of made me smile or made me realize that something big was happening. And kind of that, I think, was my first business probably, which was tutoring and teaching people the basics of computing and mathematics.
Right. So you go from there, from coming back to Israel, excited to tutor people. So, and then you probably did your service back then, and you had an incredible, you also within your IDF service, you did an incredible thing, which is the future, which is, which you spoke about previously, being a drone pilot, which was years way ahead before, it's the current norm. But after that, tell me about your first entrepreneurship startup, which you went ahead to found, the idea behind it, and what it was like back then, which I'm assuming close to almost 20 years ago, probably. What entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I can tell you, but that would reveal my age. But the first startup I was involved with was a company called Mind Echo, and that was our CEO was my good friend Shukinir, and Mind Echo was a personalization startup. And this was while I did my military service, as you mentioned. I went to school, to college, to study computer science and philosophy in Tel Aviv. And while I was getting my formal education in computer science, I was part of this team that understood that one of the things that computers do really well is to find patterns in data. And we'll come back to that theme later when we talk about my new business, retrain.AI. But even back then, it was clear that one of the things that is different about computers is that they can process information really, really quickly. And part of the challenge when we start looking at a lot of information, that it's sometimes hard for people to discover new content. So that startup's business was to develop a set of algorithms that later became known as collaborative filtering, which was the idea of exposing people to products, services, media that they didn't know was a good match for them. So it was a recommendation engine, basically. Today, we're very, very used to that because every time you shop on Amazon, you see people who bought this, also bought that. And Spotify automatically selects your music, and Netflix does recommendation of movies you might like. 20 years ago, it wasn't that trivial,
right.
That this was possible, and that startup developed a pretty robust algorithms in that area. But by and large, it was quite a business failure because it was technology for technology's sake. And again, that's a theme we'll talk a little bit deeper, maybe later in our talk today. But I think that it was kind of a classic example of really good algorithms that didn't have the appropriate business problem to solve. Right. The funny thing about that company was that in order to train the algorithms, we needed a data set. And the data set that we selected was a data set of jokes. We've amassed one of the largest collections of jokes, cartoons, funny videos. Again, in today's world of social media, it became kind of second nature to us. But back then, the idea that people could share all these kind of funny items wasn't very clear. And we've developed algorithms that could predict the ratings that people would give to jokes and send you more jokes. And it was quite viral. People would sometimes consume 60, 70 pieces of content on the platform per day. They just couldn't stop, and they would rate the jokes and then get even more jokes, and you could select the categories. And there was a lot of mathematics behind it, but there was no business. And like many businesses, when there's no business behind it, they didn't have a future as a commercial entity. I call that my business school. I never went to business school, but this was my business school, and it taught me one of the most important lessons in business, which is timing to market.
Yes.
You can't be too late, but you definitely can't be too early.
Which is the two biggest components. And that was actually you're mentioning that I was thinking of, like, you were way before your time. So besides obviously the first issue you ran into, which was no business case, right, for monetization, I guess. The second thing was, being way ahead. I was asking you, how important is timing for an entrepreneurship business or for any startup? How important is that? Like,
Yeah, I think it's actually critical because if you're too late or if you're too early, then you don't end up spending the scarce resources that you have in solving a real world problem,
Right.
right? Either because there are no real world problems to be solved because you're too early, or because other people have already solved that problem.
Mm.
So, on the view that successful startups are those that solve big problems, solving big problems for the right people at the right time becomes a critical component, because you don't want to solve problems that are too far into the future. You
Right.
definitely don't want to try and solve problems that are already solved because they're not problems anymore.
Exactly.
So in that sense, timing, I think, is probably critical.
Yeah. So, and you see all these types of diagrams, good founders, bad ideas, good ideas, bad founders, and timing, and this and that all comes together. You have to have all the stars to a certain degree aligned in order to make a successful startup. But as you're building that startup, and obviously when you start realizing there's no business case, so you went ahead and shutting it down. As a young founder, shutting down a startup, the emotions that come together with it are obviously very difficult. It sort of like resembles like a personal failure almost, because the identities are tied into that. So how did you, if we recall, because I know we're going back way, a long time ago, recall the feelings that came together with that, but then what gave you the courage to go ahead and say, you know what, I failed it. I got the incredible business lessons. Let me go ahead and launch my second startup.
Yeah, I think that I was always of the belief that startups are kind of like the coral reef. Nothing gets lost,
Mm-hmm.
and every fish that dies in the coral reef, or every coral that breaks, kind of makes its way, its DNA, its substance kind of makes its way back into the ecosystem.
Right.
And in that sense, I think it's a real approach that no single startup is going to make a difference in your career. No single business lesson is going to be the lesson. It's a continuous cycle of innovation, right? And in that sense, for people that got infected by this entrepreneurial virus, which, unlike COVID, by the way, has no vaccine, or at least no vaccine known to man. Once you get infected, it's in your system, and it pretty much what drives you. So if you failed in one, many of the people I know immediately go on to do another one. And sometimes you go and partner with other friends and you start your own company, or you go work for an early stage company. But for people that enjoy the thrill of early stage startups, I think there's no second. Very few people that I know say, "Oh, okay, I failed on this one, so let me now go work for Microsoft because I'm just not good at it." Sometimes that happens, but it's quite rare.
So then what was your second startup after you rebound from your first one?
The second one was an interesting company called Destinator,
Mm-hmm.
and Destinator was a GPS navigation startup. The main technology there was technology for map compression. And that was with my good friend and our CEO, Ronnie Kutil, who is also one of my partners at my search startup, Cultura. And the core technology there was what we called jokingly the MP3 of navigation.
Mm-hmm.
Like MP3 was a compression technology for music. There was lossy compression. The quality of an MP3 file was never as good as a proper hi-fi CD, but was good enough because it knew how to lose information selectively. We had the same sort of idea for GIS data, for mapping information. We understood that the problem at the time was that before devices have continuous communication, before 5G and 4G and 3G and 2G and WAP, devices could be synchronized to a central data source when they were offline. But then if you took the device to your car, it lost connection. So anything you needed in terms of navigation, you needed to preload on the device or on a memory card. And back then we had memory cards that were 64 megs, not 64 gigs, 64 megs large. So the challenge was, how could you compress more data, more mapping data than a car could drive in a day into one of the 64 meg cards, so you can take an offboard navigation. And this idea of this lossy compression was take a huge data set, selectively reduce it by eliminating certain information that wasn't relevant for driving or navigating, keep the essential information, but reduce the overall size of the database by maybe 95%. And that made it workable so that you can carry with you enough mapping information so you never fall off the map.
Right.
Today, with electric vehicles, people have this range anxiety. They feel that they would run out of battery. Back then, range anxiety meant people felt that they might fall off the map.
And then what were the challenges you came across that they ended up having to move forward from it? Because this seems like also way before its time. Like I remember, as a child growing up, what we did for mapping before, obviously the first Garmin that ever came out, which was revolutionary, like, big things. Back then it was a massive device. We used to print out, obviously this is before Google Maps, but Yahoo Maps, and directions and everything. That was the way to get somewhere,
Yeah, no, that company actually did really well. Sales scaled really quickly. And you mentioned Garmin, but the challenge with Garmin was just the cost. A lot of people realized that GPS navigation was going to be great, but Garmin would sell these devices for $600 or $700, and it was just too expensive for most people to afford yet another device. We realized at that point that a lot of people actually already had a mobile computer. They had a Palm Pilot or a compact iPad. This was before the iPhones. And because we could compress the map so much, we could use an existing device. We didn't need a dedicated device. So it kind of cut the cost of those devices by maybe half. We sold those kits for $299. And that company grew really quickly and was actually merged with a public entity on NASDAQ. Today you'd call that a SPAC deal. Back then it was called an RTO, reverse takeover. Mm-hmm. And that company actually did really well. Sales grew really rapidly. Then I moved on after the dot-com crash. And a lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of people lost a lot of money. The company ended up being acquired by a Canadian corporation, and it was a good time to move on.
And what'd you move on to afterwards?
After that, I took a break, and I decided to go back to school. And I decided to go get my PhD. I went to Cornell up in Ithaca to breathe the fresh air of upstate New York and enjoy the cold weather and advance my scholarship a little bit. And I spent a few beautiful years up in Ithaca writing a thesis about open information systems very conveniently. And in order to limit the research, I was only interested in what people can do that begins with the letter C. So I investigated how people, that's a joke, of course, but I investigated how large groups of people communicate, collaborate, create communities, and exert command and control in building large-scale open information systems. So I looked at systems like Wikipedia, open source software, but interestingly, there are many other examples in other domains, such as open source biology, or very interesting examples from history of military intelligence, and many other places where large groups of people to come and build large-scale information systems. And I developed a theory that explains how they do it, why they do it, what are some of the mechanisms that enable those systems to grow and flourish.
Interesting, and it's something I'm sure we could talk about on a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole other talk. But I think that today, again, as we see the success of systems like Wikipedia and open source software, for example, a lot of those ideas become trivial when some of these things just started. It wasn't clear whether they're gonna ever work, but it was interesting to get the inside look at how these things work.
Right. So one of the things I'm assuming you yourself realize, but I myself, from hearing the conversation so far, the pattern recognition. And, what are the patterns so far that I'm recognizing coming across between, what you've worked on obviously as a child, from, starting with tutoring for teaching people how to be a tutor for computers, then also going ahead and creating the recommendation software before recommendations became a standard thing, then working on maps before maps became the standard thing, and then working on your thesis, all the C's, communication, collaboration, communities, which before it became the norm, is the pattern of sort of, I wouldn't call it fortune telling, but being able to a certain degree, start seeing the future of what is the future going to be, what, is necessary for the future. Obviously, no one can tell the future. No one knows, but you're able to recognize the patterns. And one of the things I'm realizing is that you had that foresight in order to start creating things or look at what is doing, sort of like, what is what are communities, what are consumers going to need and want? So that obviously that insight is incredible. But how is that? I'm sure I'm not sure if you recognize that yourself, but take us to your third startup, which was also very revolutionary for its time, which you're able to foresight to create something that's actually, an incredible company to date. But let's start from going back to the third startup you had.
Yeah, so the third startup was Cultura, but just a word about kind of being able to foresee the future. I definitely cannot foresee the future, but But one thing that I learned in building products and services is that if you focus on big problems, and if you focus on early indications of success, and if you listen to what people actually need, then you could probably relatively early on in a trend figure out what's coming, right? It doesn't take tremendous amounts of data to see trends. And if you're attuned to that, if you understand, if you look at the moments of change, and if you actually talk with a lot of people and you understand and you let them tell you what they need, you can pretty quickly hone in on what are some of the problems people are facing and what are some of the solutions, and you can extrapolate from that.
Right.
And that's exactly what we did in my third startup, Cultura. This is a company that I helped start together with 3 other serial entrepreneurs. Ron, who was the CEO of the previous company, Destinator, the GPS company, and my very good friends, Eran and Michal. And the 4 of us realized that something big was happening in the world of media. And we realized, and especially given my academic background and Michal's academic background in open systems, we realized that the world of collaboration around media was dramatically changing. We saw the success of systems like Wikipedia, but we realized that the parallel of Wikipedia for media didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is that we looked at the very strong concentration of creation of media in the industry. So very few studios, for example, very few news agencies produce all the content that billions of people consume. And we realized that if the pattern that we've identified was correct, and particularly as devices like the iPhones were coming to the market with the means of production of video becoming ubiquitous and billions of people walking with video cameras in their pockets, essentially, then something very dramatic was going to happen.
Right.
And that's a trend that we saw early, and we decided to start Cultura, which was the first open system for video. And Cultura, since then, just the end of the story is that the company became very big, over 1,000 customers. I can't disclose any financial details because the company is actually in the process of going public, but for those interested, all the details are on the SEC's website. But I think what the company publicly discloses revenues well over $100 million, over 1,000 customers, 600 employees, offices in many of the big global cities. So really kind of became a very large success within its domain of enterprise video systems.
Wow.
And we can chat more about it because that was a wild run.
Yeah. So then what motivates you personally? Like going from one startup to next, one problem to next, one solution, what personally motivates you?
I think that I like to see technology being put to good use, right? Mm-hmm. And I like to problem solve. And if I can find a problem that could be solved with technologies, then I get 2 brownie points, in the sense that real world problem with a technological solution. And the third element to that I would say that motivates me is scale.
Right.
I'm at a point where I'm very interested in problems of scale. So you could solve a lot of things locally. Makes a big difference if you can solve them globally. Mm-hmm. And I think that the problems I've been busy solving the last few years, from GPS navigation to video systems, and we'll talk soon about the last startup in the area of HR tech and solving for the skills gap. I think that I'm very interested in very big problems that can make a big difference in the lives of many people, and that could be solved with technology. The trifecta is kind of very interesting to me.
No, 100%. So then let me ask, like this, from problem-solving standpoint, as a serial entrepreneur, do the problems, each startup obviously faces their own challenges.
Right.
But then there are generic problems too. Do the problems get easier from one startup to another startup? Do you able to see the patterns also in there to make sure you don't make the same mistakes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. But I think that one kind of big mistake that people make is that they lose sight of the problem they're solving. They get excited about the technology, right? And they start innovating in technological terms, and they lose sight of the problem. So as time goes by, kind of the meta problem is being focused on the original problem, if you will. And I think that's something that as you build more businesses, you get more focused on that. Are we solving a real world problem, or are we off on a tangent here just because we found some shiny object, or we're pursuing oh, we're going to do a rewrite to the code because there's a new version of this or the other library, right? Are you providing customer value or not? So I think that's one thing you get better at as time goes by, which is that kind of the customer focus.
Right. So it's customer focused, deliberate focus over there. So how do you keep focused?
I think a lot of it is really staying close to the end users. I wake up with the same question every day. Are we delivering value to our end customers? Whether those are the businesses that buy our software or those are the users that use the software that these businesses help.
Right.
You have to remember the end user. And if you do that, I think that you can keep very focused.
Right.
I think in the same vein, the other thing that I learned while building these businesses is that the team makes all the difference, right? And one of the big mistakes that companies do is that the team gets bloated and there are people that get hired just because they're nice people, but it's not very clear what they contribute or even if they're good people and they have good skills, it might not be a good match for that team. So I often think about startups as kind of an organism. Mm-hmm. And just like in your body, every organ has a function and they all have to be fully coordinated. The same is true in a startup. And oftentimes you have these organizations that have this bizarre org chart because somebody was a friend of somebody or because somebody was hired and they no longer do anything meaningful, but nobody's willing to tell them that, or because you really need to hire for another role, but it's hard because all your competitors are also hiring, so you give up and you don't hire for that role even though you really need it, etc. You're creating these lopsided organizations that eventually end up failing because they are just not the right type of organism for the task. They don't adapt
right
to the environment in the way that they need to.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, because I see another thing like, based off that is like, most times startups will have okay, always two co-founders, sometimes three maximum. But from all the startups you started, it seems like that you've had more, usually 2, 3, or 4, sometimes 4 co-founders.
Yes.
Is that a challenge? Do you suggest that to other founders?
I think that generally speaking, the more the merrier. I wouldn't go more than 5, but I think that probably 3 or 4 is probably ideal. Because you have to remember that most of these organizations are in for the long haul. And you think, oh, we're going to do this quick round, build this product, sell to Google in 3 years. No. In most cases, that doesn't happen. And if you're definitely big no in my mind is to start a startup alone, because that would be like, trying to cross the ocean in a canoe on your own. Not a good idea. You're going to get mad if nothing else. And so at the very minimum, I think you need at least one co-founder, but probably at least another co-founder, because 2 people also might tend to get into dynamics and fights and indecision and whatnot. So 3 is probably better than 2. And I think personally, that probably 4 might even be better than 3, because then you can create all sorts of interesting dynamics for decision maker, for prioritization, for when somebody maybe has a personal period where they need to take some time off or just slow down and whatnot. So I'd probably say that 3 or 4 is probably ideal.
Wow. So then you're at Kaltura. Kaltura is booming. Business is going great. You're building, you're scaling, you're acquiring more customers, you're building an incredible product. And then it's like you almost got that startup itch again. You're like, okay, I have to start something new. I'm getting that itch. And, I'm not sure what made you decide that, but I'm assuming it's somewhere around there to found something. And you go ahead and start your next startup, retrain.AI. So yes. Let's get into Retrain. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And we have a ton of questions based upon that also over there.
Yeah, so yes, after over a decade at Kaltura, the video problem was largely solved. I mean, it's an ongoing problem and Kaltura is going to continue to do well. But it was time to hire younger management to go run the business day to day. I'm retaining my board seat and can help provide the oversight and steering. Don't need to run the business day to day anymore. But I was itching to solve another problem. And one of the problems that I saw, and in part I saw that through my experience at Kaltura by selling our video system to many organizations around the world, was that a very major use case for video within enterprises was actually for learning and development. Mm. When I talked with customers around the world, it became clear that part of the reasons that they need a video system was because they're having a hard time training their own people.
Right.
And when I kind of dove into that, I realized how big that training problem had become. because it turns out that there's a huge skills gap in today's workforce. And that skills gap is not only an employer's problem, it's actually a societal problem. It turns out that the nature of work itself is changing. And I believe, and at Retrain, we believe that a real tsunami is coming to the world of work, and it's driven by multiple vectors, including mostly AI and automation that are really changing the nature of work, including changes to the composition of the demographics with aging population on one hand, but consumer sensibilities of millennials on the other hand. And then, of course, with COVID-19, which really accelerated a lot of the timelines. So vector number one is that the nature of work itself is changing. The demand for skills and new types of skills is changing. In order to be a teacher, you needed to be able to write with a white chalk on a blackboard, and now you need to operate Zoom. Mm-hmm. In order to work at a warehouse, you needed to know how to lift boxes, and now you need to operate a robot. In order to be a pilot, you need to be at the wheels, and now you need to operate a completely automated flight path system. And that is true across the board, from high skills, mid-skill, low skills. The nature of work is changing. That's vector number one. Vector number two is that there's a real supply problem. Mm-hmm. So there's just not enough people with the right types of skills. So on one hand, we see in the papers all these titles like the robots are coming, they're going to take everybody's job. The reality is most employers are having a very hard time finding people as it is. So on one hand, we have very high unemployment. On the other hand, employers across the board are reporting skill shortages. Now in a post-pandemic world, there's all these headlines that part of the recovery is going to be limited by inability to find people. Mm-hmm. And intuitively, I think people understand that. They understand that there are a shortage of pilots or nurses or programmers. What people mostly don't know is there's also a shortage of drivers. While everybody's talking about self-driving cars, and soon enough, there's not going to be a job for any driver. Right now, there are 2 million driver jobs open, probably in the US alone, right? And the same is true in supply chain, the same is true in healthcare, the same is true in manufacturing, just not enough people. So how could it be that on one hand, we have too many people, and on the other hand, we don't have enough people? The answer is there's a huge skills gap. The people that are ready to work and willing to work do not necessarily have the skills that the employers are looking for. Mm-hmm. And that is a demand and supply problem, which is severe. And the challenge with that is that unemployment is the symptom of that problem. Unemployability is the real problem. And while if you look carefully, and you can look at this article I published on Forbes a few weeks ago, we looked carefully at the recovery job data, for example. You'd see that the overall number of employed people is rising, so unemployment is going down. But if you look at the percentage of people on long-term unemployment, you realize that it's going up, meaning that some people can bounce in and out of the workforce, other people bounce out and can never bounce back in. Right. And that is a very, very, very big problem. And the third vector is that there are no good systems to solve this problem today. The HR tech or the HR stack of technology has been neglected for many, many years. There are a few very large dominant players like Oracle or Workday or SuccessFactors dominate this industry, but by and large, if you ever work for a large organization, you know that if you're looking for information about people, probably the last place you'd look for is in the HR system, which is probably very dated and doesn't really have any real world data about your team, about the demand, about the supply. It definitely doesn't have enough data about the relevant skills. So that's retrain.AI's mission, is to build a new system and a new type of knowledge graph that unifies data about jobs, about people, and about training pathways in order to solve the skills gap. And our objective is to help 10 million people find jobs or better jobs if they're already employed and want to move up.
Wow.
In the first 5 years of operation.
That's incredible. So then let me ask like this, which is, Retrain AI, that's incredible mission, to help with 10 million people get them employed and retraining them sort of to help them up-level their skills. But how would you connect that to a personal mission of yours or personal value?
Yeah, so I think that it's my strong belief, and this is, I know, also a strong belief of my two co-founders, Avi and Isabel. Isabel came from kind of HR tech, started the company in HR tech that was doing placement in the public services sector straight out of school. And Avi came from many years in the Israeli military intelligence and trying to bring AI technology to the military. So when the three of us got together and we thought about it, I think that part of the challenge that we see is that this technology revolution, and you can call that kind of the fourth industrial revolution, is really going to leave a lot of people behind.
Right.
And we think that that could be fixed, right? Part of our personal mission is, if we go back to what we discussed earlier, is to solve a big problem and to do it with technology, but to do it in an equitable and fair way that actually gives benefits to the multiple stakeholders.
Right.
And this is why retrain.AI is not a charity. It's a for-profit corporation backed by VCs. It has a strong for-profit motive, but we believe that we can do well by doing good. We have a strong social mission because we believe that this is a billion people's problem. And I say a billion people because if you look at the data and if you look at the research, and we understand that in some segments of the market, maybe up to 90% of the jobs are either being eliminated or changing dramatically. And if you look at research by people like Carl Frey, for example, who's one of our advisors, the head of the Future Work Institute at Oxford University, who analyzed this susceptibility to automation problem, you realize that some markets as we know them are going to completely disappear, right? But even if you look at the low estimates, that not 90% in some segments, but only 20 or 30% in other segments are going to completely transform. And if you understand that there are more than 3 billion people now on the global payroll, this doesn't include data in China, then there's more than 1 billion people that need to acquire new skills over the next decade. So it's a tremendous problem. And as we were fundraising, we had this kind of joke within our fundraising deck, but we had a little video from the head of the Manpower Group, one of the bigger placement companies in the world, who talked about the skills gap as humanity's number one challenge. And we would show that and say, well, he's probably wrong. Global warming is probably a bigger challenge. This must be only the number two problem. Right. But it's definitely up there. It's definitely one of the bigger problems that humanity is facing.
Right. So then you mentioned on the fundraising trip. So as a serial entrepreneur, as a fundraising, you obviously come with a credibility, which, if you were to take a first-time entrepreneur, fundraising for the same problem as retrain.AI and take yourself, I'm assuming you'll probably get funded much quicker. It comes with some type of credibility in that aspect of, being able to do it. So they're what are the easier aspects as a serial entrepreneur? Obviously, we spoke about the problems before, but what are the easier aspects of it? At the same time, and we'll tap into the next thing afterwards.
Yeah, I think you can think about it as kind of a demand supply or kind of two-sided equation. As you're an entrepreneur, supposedly if you were successful before that, you picked up some skills along the way, like customer focus, customer centricity, data centricity, which makes it easier for you to select the next big challenges to really kind of get the team around you and whatnot. Right. But the other thing, and this is part of why there's networks of innovation, with the biggest one being Silicon Valley, but to some extent also in the Israeli ecosystem or in Boston's Route 128 exists, is because you're creating a network. When you're coming to solve another problem the second time around, then you already know people. You know investors, and you know potential clients, and you know employees, and you know vendors that could supply you with laptops and anything else that you would need. And starting a company is a lot of kind of under the hood type of work, right? You don't want to think about it, but maybe the biggest challenge that you have initially is getting the accounts on the cloud and making sure that you have secure connections and getting the right laptops for cheap and being able to hire first 2 or 3 people on the team and getting easy access to 1 or 2 design partners and all of those things before you can even start coding. There's quite a few barriers of entry. And if you've been around the rodeo once or twice, then it becomes much, much easier for you to be able to do it again.
Yeah. And I love what you mentioned over there, because most people, most founders, especially early founders or anybody who wants to go into entrepreneurship, they think, they have a passion to solve a certain problem. But they think they'll be working on that passion most of the time of the day. Right. But really, that's only 5% of actual work you're going to do. 95% of the work is all the work that you mentioned before, all the prior stuff and the daily boring work on a daily basis. That's where the discipline and persistence comes in, facing those issues over there.
I think there's a big speed bump cost. Hopefully, after you pass that speed bump, you can spend more than 5%
Right.
kind of on the core mission. And as time goes by, yes, you do want to spend more time kind of the core mission, which to me is always spending more time with customers and spending more time with really solving the problem. But initially, yes, you need to find offices and you need to get equipment and you need to sign up vendors and you need to develop a security policy and you need to do all these things that are irrelevant of what your actual product is, but you still have to get through them. So I think my advice would be go through those things as fast as you can. Don't cut corners, but remember that at the other side of that speed bump, you could start speeding up, and I think that makes a big difference in your ability to kind of speed up beyond the speed bump.
Right.
Makes a big difference in companies that are ready to scale.
Right. So was there ever a time, like tell me some of the hard times you went through in your entrepreneurship career, because entrepreneurship is not just a job. Entrepreneurship itself is a career. The entrepreneur,
Right.
you know, it's your one thing to another thing, but that's any type of hard times you went through in all your 4 startups, where either you thought, forget about it, I'm done, I'm giving up over here, or times that you're just not sure where to go. And then what was the way how you prevailed and went through?
Yeah, I think there's always ups and downs. Even in successful startups, there's always ups and downs because remember that a startup doesn't live in kind of flatland. You always live between the reality, which supposedly has progress in product releases and more customers, and the line of inflated expectations that you've created in the environment. So a lot of those inflated expectations already exist because you told your investors you're going to do so much, and you promised your teams that their equity is going to be so much, and you promised deliverables to the customers and whatnot. So in some sense, even if you're doing really well, there's always more to be done. And in that sense, that creates constant tensions that even in times when the companies succeed, you're under pressure. And definitely in times when things go wrong, like the product doesn't work, or you have crashes in your system, or customers want to leave you to go for a competitor, or the money is starting to run out. All of these things are all things that I've experienced multiple times, right? And I think that the way to get out of it is always to remember the mission, to remember the good days during those bad days, to really remember the team of people that are following you, and that you can't really let them down, and that the only way in startups is forward, right? Startups do not have neutral. You could go reverse and then you're probably on your way down, but pretty much the only gear is 5 gears forward.
No, for sure.
And you have to remember that any day of the year.
Yeah. It's like the highs are very high and the lows are very low. There's
Yes.
no middle ground. There's no like,
absolutely. That's definitely a good way to put it. And but as you said, those highs are very high, and that supposedly is what keeps you going.
Right.
On
So
the
then,
days of the lows.
right. So I'm assuming you probably also had the opportunity to mentor multiple entrepreneurs.
Right.
You probably did, being a successful entrepreneur yourself. You probably seen, I hope a lot of people went ahead and launched, former employees of yours went ahead to launch own startups. What are the characteristics that an entrepreneur needs to have?
Great question. Yeah, I saw a lot of startups. I invested in a few of them, and my team at Cultura was very entrepreneurial. So out of Cultura, there were 6 or 7 other VC-backed companies that just came out of that company. Wow. But I also was a mentor at the New York City Economic Development Council's mentorship program for young startups. So over the years, I definitely see a lot of entrepreneurs. I think that there's no one-size-fits-all description. I don't think entrepreneurs comes in all all colors, sizes, genders, preference, from all walks of life. I've seen entrepreneurs that you wouldn't think about them as big entrepreneurs, and I've seen big honchos that went to all the right schools and failed miserably. Right? I think that the one thing that I can say is probably common to all the ones that succeeded is very significant focus on real world problems. Right, and that I think is a prerequisite. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. People that are not really obsessed with solving big problems, the chances of them succeeding, I think, are very low. People that are obsessed with that still need to have many other traits as well. But I think that is, the commonality among entrepreneurs. You could be a man, you could be a woman, you could be an immigrant, you could be an old guy inventing their career anew, or you could be a first-time college dropout. Doesn't matter. Are you solving a real-world problem? And I've seen them all.
Right. So then flipping the script from there, what are the things that you see people constantly making mistakes that they should be able to avoid?
I think the biggest common mistake that I see is that people are too focused on technology. And again, bear in mind that my view is biased because my mentorship and my investment is always focused on technology companies, mostly on software companies. So maybe in other domains it's different. But in technology circles, the biggest mistake people do is that they focus on the technology instead of focusing on the problem and the users.
Right.
Oh, what if we could do this? Let's develop this other screen. Let's rewrite this piece of code. Let's integrate with this other system. Those are all technology-driven decisions. And it could be that every so often you do all these technology-driven things, but you also happen to, through that, solve a real-world problem bigger, better, faster, and then you're on your way to success. But that to me is happenstance, right? In contrast, if you're focused on understanding customer pain, why is my system needed in the world? Not because I can rewrite a piece of code because there's a cool change to the way Apple tracks phones, right? That's not interesting, right? What might be interesting is that my customers are businesses that want to connect with consumers, and given a change in how iPhones track phones, they now lost touch with their consumers, and I can solve that, for example, right? Or in the case that we're solving it, retrain.AI, the problem is that the systems that they have today are failing them. So we're developing technology that could help people basically gain pretty basic knowledge about their people. You know, you would think that the existing systems would have solved the problem 15 years ago, but they haven't. So I think that is the biggest mistake: developing technology for technology's sake instead of developing technology to solve a real world problem.
Right. And it's almost like, to the point of people thinking, oh, if we build it, they will come.
Exactly.
Similar case over there.
And I think that part of the reason so many people make that mistake is because sometimes it's true. You build it and they will come. Because if you developed a great product that solves a real world problem and a lot of people hear about it, yes, they would come. And they would buy your product in droves, and that's great. But they didn't come because you built it. They came because you're solving a problem. And that's the big difference between success and failure.
Yeah, that's totally, it's 100% Shay. So what advice then do you give to new entrepreneurs that are coming out, and they're coming to you, they're saying, Shay, what do we do? Or what do we need, or anything?
I tell them to go find a big problem to solve, right? And if they can't articulate in a few sentences what that problem is, and it doesn't mean they couldn't do a startup, or it doesn't mean that they're on the wrong track. It just means they need to apply more thinking before they start coding, right? And it's like, really get the problem definition honed is my first advice typically. And I sometimes, people come to me for money or advice, and they come with this brilliant presentation about this, that, or the other change in the tech market and some cool technology coming out of academia, whatnot. And my question to them is always the same, which is, what problem is this going to solve? And sometimes the answer is, we don't know yet. And that's perfectly fine. But then my advice would be, go and figure it out. Talk with customers and see, do you have technology that could solve a real world problem? Come back to me when you figured out what problem you're solving.
Now, what happens when they do figure out the problem? They are starting for a real problem. What do you tell them to do next?
I think the next thing is to get the right team, right? And we talked earlier about co-founders, but startups is not for the faint of heart. It's a rocket ride to the moon. You got to make sure that you have a diverse founding team that complement each other, and hopefully also have some proof point that they can work with one another, and that also has some sort of diversity within the team. So if it's a bunch of programmers that all met in a computer science class in Stanford, I wouldn't necessarily trust that, because they don't necessarily have the diversity of opinion and diversity of perspective. So I would say the next thing is, if you figured out the big problem you want to solve and you're convinced that you can solve it, go get the team that could actually start solving it, and make sure that that team is very well-rounded and is ready to spend the next few years together and could do that well.
Right. And so then what is next for Shay? Is it the focus right now is building retrain.AI into, I'm assuming $1 billion business to really, upscale 10 million people. If someone like you, I'm assuming definitely does a lot of future planning. I'm assuming to a certain degree, goal planning for the future.
Yeah. So I think the next few years are retrain.AI. I think that retrain.AI is not $1 billion value business. It's $1 billion revenue type of business. It's going to take a few years to build, because we set out this goal of helping 10 million people, but I think we can help many more than 10 million people. And I think that our objective is to become the kind of platform as a service layer. we call it the talent intelligence platform, but we want to be kind of the global talent intelligence platform and really help understand what are the trends in the labor market, what are the skills that people need to acquire, how could we inform both educational institutions, employers, states, countries, individuals in being able to find the right training pathways to acquire those skills. So that's a very big mission. And I think I'm very happy spending the next few years on this. We're just getting started, launching our first commercial customers this quarter. So we're at the beginning of the cycle, and I look forward to kind of building that.
Wow, that's awesome. So then what do we tell a young Shay, graduating Tel Aviv University for the first time, and he has a whole entire world ahead of him? You could either go, become a barista in Starbucks, or you could go work for some other startup in Silicon Valley, or, he could launch his own startup, whatever it may be. But what message would you tell him, like in hindsight?
I would say always lean in, always engage. There's no neutral or reverse, always push forward. And those who dare win.
Those who dare win. I love that. I hope you have that hung up somewhere in a sign, next to you, over there on top of your computer or something.
Absolutely.
But Shay, I want to thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible. I learned a tremendous amount, a lot of what it takes to build a successful startup, but not just one startup, a second, third, and fourth. And a lot of it boils down to is making sure you're solving a real world problem, but not just solving a real world problem, making sure you're solving a real problem that you're able to connect to personally and able to. And then once you have that, go ahead and formulate the correct team around you. Because when you have the right team, you're able to overcome all obstacles and challenges that come your way. And this is not going to only be beneficial to me, which I learned a ton, but it's going to be beneficial to multiple others, new entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, our current entrepreneurs that are going through, they're going to listen to this and take inspiration from your words. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And feel free to check out retrain.AI. Send me an email if you have more questions.
For sure.